All right, everybody, welcome to the final lecture of February 2021. I'm recording this on Thursday, so the weather's really nice outside. I hope you guys enjoy it while the weather's nice. Don't forget about your homework assignment, the historical context. This is a challenging one, so make sure you're reading my announcement and reading the instructions. If you have any questions, please let me know. Other than that, when we come back next time, it'll be March, so right on. And looking forward, then you're going to have a historical contingency assignment next week. And then you've got your spring break after that. So, yay! Lord knows we all need the break. Okay. So, here's the important stuff. Let's get going on this. So, what we're going to talk about today is the 1920s. And this is a period of incredibly rapid change. And whenever there's so much rapid change, there are what are called traditionalists, people who want to kind of go back to the way things were before that, and there are modernists. And these are people that want to move forward with progress and change. So today we could call these progressives and conservatives. You know, the terminology changes, but we see this always in times of rapid change, not just in American history, but all around the world. So really we're seeing those tensions playing their way out, especially in the 1920s. And today we often refer to these as the culture wars. Now, one of the most divisive aspects of the culture war was where we finished last time, and that was with the rise of Prohibition. This begins at the end of World War I, and it continues on until 1933. And in fact, one of the first things that FDR is going to do when he becomes president is he begins the movement of ending prohibition, and that will eventually lead to the 21st Amendment. That's the only time in American history that one amendment has overturned another. The 21st overturns the 18th. But this isn't the only case. It's just one of many. So you had a whole lot of people who believed that alcohol was the main problem in America. We see the same thing with the war on drugs today. Others who felt, you know what, you can't tell me what to do. And we actually see rates of alcoholism and alcohol consumption rising during this time period. But those weren't the only divisive lines, breaking lines in American culture. This is the 1920s is a time of incredibly rapid technological change as well. We see a huge outpouring of new technologies. This is when Henry Ford really came on the scene. He'd been around for a while, but by the 1920s, he opened up his Rouge River plant that's just outside of Detroit. And there he intelligently, he paid his workers twice as much as anybody else in America at the time. There were just two types of people that weren't allowed to ever work for him, and those were African Americans and Jews. Henry Ford was very racist, like super duper duper racist by this time. But we've seen the 1920s was a time that actually welcomed and encouraged that kind of attitude and behavior. It was supported by scientific racism, certainly supported by the president at the time, Wilson, and then on into Harding and others. But at the same time, he was rolling off a finished Model T every 10 seconds. They were all exactly the same. Again, like you can have them in any color as long as that color is black. So everything was standardized. Everything was exactly the same. All of the assembly line. You stood in one place. You did the exact same job every single second for the rest of your life. Ben, please just stop. Okay? Please just stop and leave it alone. Part of this technological change is also, it's not just transportation for the automobile, but this is also when we're starting to see flight become much more popular. Now, of course, the first flight actually took place in France, but in the United States, we take credit for this. Orville and Wilbur Wright took the first airplane flight. It was just 12 seconds, but this happened December 17th, 1903, right here in North Carolina at Kitty Hawk. Now, quite honestly, you could glide for 12 seconds in a stiff breeze off of Kitty Hawk. So this was not nearly that impressive, but over time, aviation slowly got off the ground, and especially by the time of World War I, this is when we start to see biplanes involved. And then in the 1920s, we start to see commercial flights. where we're seeing this used for crop dusting. The wealthy are starting to kind of play around with this. Amelia Earhart becomes very famous for this. Charles Lindbergh in 1927, became the first person to fly nonstop over the Atlantic. And it's in a famous plane called the Spirit of St. Louis. And if you go to Washington, D.C. today and you go to the Air and Space Museum, you look right above you as you come in, and it's a beautiful silver airplane that he flew over the Atlantic all by himself from New York to Paris. Took him 33 straight hours. Other technologies are transforming the world. And many of these, like the airplane, had been invented earlier, but really have their heyday in the 1920s. Radio. Radio had been invented in the 1890s by an Italian American named Guglielmo Marconi, but it's really in the 1920s that it starts to become commercial radio. And more Americans are buying radio sets. In fact, the first announcement of a presidential victory was Warren G. Harding's landslide victory in 1920. We also get radio programs. Americans start to gather around the radio on regular times. Some of these sports becomes very famous during this time. This is the age of Babe Ruth. And baseball becomes America's game during this time. Sports were incredibly popular. Politicians very quickly realized the power of radio as well. But there was also, once again, a great element of race and racism going on. Probably the most popular show at the time was called Amos and Andy. And this was a show in which two white Americans portrayed themselves as African Americans in as stereotypical and racist a way as you can possibly imagine. This was an extension of the old Jim Crow vaudeville acts. And blackface is an extension of this. So we continue to see those kind of attitudes. This is also the age of Thomas Edison, and the first movies start to come out during this period. The first full-length film was D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation. And I mentioned this before with Woodrow Wilson. This is a stunning film that, it was a silent film, but it presents the Klan as the saviors of white America. The first talkie film is The Jazz Singer with Al Jolson, and Hollywood, California became very quickly the hot spot for the manufacturing and creation of film, and this is really in the 1920s. What most people don't know is that a lot of the early films were today what we would call almost pornographic. There was a lot of nudity. Female vampires were always topless. They were called vamps. That's a term that we still hear used in Hollywood. And some of these are really amazing pieces of cinematography. But very, very quickly, by the middle of the 1920s, we're seeing that conservative, or back then, more traditionalists would have been the term. They started censoring Hollywood, and critics were really worried back then, as they are now, that this popular culture lowered the popular taste and that they were challenging to old values, especially family values. Radio shows and movies seem to lessen the interaction between individuals and heightened how passive we were. Does that sound familiar? I mean, this is 100 years ago, and we're hearing the exact same criticism to this day. Probably one of the most interesting of these kind of viewpoints, or a moment in time here that really pits these traditionalists versus the modernists, is what is called the Scopes monkey trial. Now, let me get I forgot to get on my stupid Word document here. Give me just a second. There we go. Come on. This Scopes monkey trial, as it was known at the time. John Scopes was a biology teacher in Tennessee. And at this time, Tennessee had passed a law, the Tennessee legislature passed a law outlawing the teaching of evolution. Well, evolution by this time had been a theory for 60, 70 years. There was a lot of evidence to back it up. And John Scopes fully intended to teach evolution. And in fact, he knew this was going to violate the law. And this was really a test case. In fact, when he did this, the police were already present. He knew he would get arrested. He knew this would go to trial. And this ends up becoming one of the kind of trials of the century. Oh my God, how many of those have we had? But this goes out on radio daily, and Americans are listening to this, and it really pits these two groups in American society against each other. What's really interesting about this are the attorneys. There, you have William Jennings Bryan. This is the guy who would run for president at least twice by this time, if not three times, hadn't won yet. And he goes against a very famous jurist, a lawyer named Clarence Darrow, Darrow. And he was like the premier lawyer of his day. All right. So this was kind of the OJ trial of its day, or whatever the trial of the century is now. Who knows what it's going to be later on. What's really interesting is that John Scopes was on trial here, and probably more on a larger scale, really the entire kind of traditional values and traditionalist views. William Jennings Bryan was a devout Christian, and he represented those traditionalist views. Darrow was defending John Scopes, there's John Scopes right there, and presenting this kind of modernist view based on science and evidence. Well, there's a really interesting moment at the end of this trial in which Darrow actually called William Jennings Bryan to the stand, the opposing attorney. Now, Bryan didn't have to do this, but he agreed. He sits on the stand, and Clarence Darrow kind of walks him through this. You can hear these recordings. Go on YouTube, you can hear these. And at one point, Darrow starts to ask William Jennings Bryan if the Bible is the literal truth. So if everything in the Bible, did that literally happen? Or are there parts of the Bible that are metaphors, are stories, or parables is often the term that it's called. And eventually, Bryan admits that there are parts of the Bible that are parables. They're not literal events. And so Darrow starts pushing him on this. So how do you know which was literal truth and which are parables? Well, scholars say this and they disagree. Okay, so then how can you use the Bible to fight against science? Guys, we still see these divisions to this day, okay? Just recently, Tennessee once again outlawed the teaching of evolution. And for decades, they required that you teach creationism alongside evolution. That was the case for decades. So in many ways, I would argue that we're right in the heart of this very same culture wars that we saw 100 years ago. And, quite frankly, I don't care which side you turn down, you end up being upon, but realize that in many ways, we're repeating a lot of the same old arguments that we've had in the past. And I'm not really sure if it's worth our time. Women were at the heart of all of this. These women now emancipated because of the 19th Amendment, given the right to vote. That means that they could also sit on juries and hold political office, run for office for the first time in American history, ever. We've been around for this time by 130 years, and for the first time. So in other words, there has been more time in American history where women had no legal rights than there has been when they've had any legal rights at all. Okay. So these new women, these flappers, as they were called, that was the kind of nickname that they got. And these flappers, they were often younger women, but now they're out publicly singing and dancing, wearing short skirts, plunging necklines, drinking, smoking, cursing, acting like men. Especially in an age in which Sigmund Freud and his ideas of psychoanalysis and sexuality and childhood were all kind of tied up together in this, there was a lot of confusion and a lot of resistance to this. A lot of traditionalists thought back then, as many do to this day, that a woman's place is in the home, that you should be there making meals and children and caring for that, and that should be enough. That was God's intended position for women. Maybe so, maybe not. I'm not here to argue either way on that. That's entirely up to you. We also see, though, that women began to get organized. Margaret Sanger, Sanger, is famous for advocating for birth control for women. And we're still having these arguments to this day about that. She also would organize the National Woman's Party in 1923 to campaign for an equal rights amendment. We still don't have that. Above all, this is the jazz age. And this gives birth to an entirely new and distinctive American form of music. Now, that had really started in the 19 teens, but it starts to explode in the 1920s, especially with the popularity of radio. So here's where we get especially African American artists, Joseph King Oliver, W.C. Handy, Jelly Roll Morton. These guys gave birth to a form of jazz that is often called bebop. And it very much connects to hip hop and rap music of today. The same kind of beats and rhymes are being used today. Well, not so much today in modern rap, but certainly in the stuff that came out in the 80s, 90s, and on into the early 20th century. A lot of this was centered on the cities in the North where African Americans had just started moving in. So let's take New York City, for example. Oftentimes, this whole movement gets referred to as the Harlem Renaissance. And that's true to an extent, but that name kind of it hides the reality that this Renaissance wasn't just happening in New York. It was happening in cities like Detroit and St. Louis and Cleveland, wherever there was a large African American population that was relatively new. And in all of those cities, they were segregated into specific neighborhoods. Harlem. Harlem was the only place in New York City where Black people were legally allowed to live. And that's because it had been a Jewish enclave, but then the Jewish population moved out. They moved into places like Bedford-Stuyvesant and Soho, and yet they still owned the properties in Harlem, and they would rent them to African Americans at very high rents. So the tenants would have rent parties. After the Cotton Club was closed for the night, then artists like Ella Fitzgerald and Duke Ellington, Charlie Parker, Thelonious Monk, Cab Calloway. You can clearly hear that I have an affinity for these guys, for these artists. They would go to these people's homes and apartments and hold parties where they'd sell beer, they'd have an entrance fee to see the artist, and that's how you paid your rent. And this led to an incredible kind of cross-cultural feeding where you have written artists and visual artists, singers and players all coming together and feeding off of each other and encouraging each other. And this leads to one of the most important explosions of African American culture that we've ever seen. We see this in the music of the period, but also in the literature of the period. And maybe that's really the part that I connected to. Writers like James Baldwin, not only African American, but gay. So at the time, that was a double whammy of new, but an amazing artist and writer. His poem, I Too, is probably one of the most powerful pieces I've ever heard that speaks about equality and equity for everybody in America. Aren't I also an American? Langston Hughes, one of the great literary lights, not just of African American culture, but of American culture at all. Other women got involved in this as well. Zora Neale Hurston, not only a prolific author, but an amazing public speaker. Her book called Their Eyes Were Watching God is absolutely an American classic. And if you haven't read it yet, put it on your list. It's an amazing piece. So the Harlem Renaissance wasn't just in Harlem, it also blossomed out into really nearly any city in the northern or even in the West. We see a great renaissance of African American culture in San Francisco as well at the same time. This also leads to a great surge in African American pride. And one of the more interesting figures in all of this wasn't an artist, but was a man. His name is Marcus Garvey. He's a fascinating figure. Marcus Garvey was, he argued for what he called Pan-Africanism. That all the people of African descent in the world needed to come together and help each other. And he actually said that that African Americans in the United States should go, quote, back to Africa. And this is a movement that had even been encouraged by Abraham Lincoln, but in a very different way. Here, what Garvey is saying is that black people from America should go back to Africa and they should establish themselves there. They should self segregate and they should go back to a place where they wouldn't be discriminated against, where they wouldn't be, killed in Tulsa or some other race riot. Now, Garvey actually founded what's called the United Negro Improvement Association, and this would inspire later African Americans, specifically Malcolm X. Malcolm X's father was a man named Malcolm Little, and he was a close associate with Marcus Garvey, and even helped him raise money for this period, for this movement of back to Africa. It wasn't just African Americans who were included among these literary lights of the period. We see an explosion of literary production in the 1920s. And I want to give you just a few names. F. Scott Fitzgerald is a classic example of this. The Great Gatsby and This Side of Paradise really captured the spirit of the jazz age, but sometimes in really absurd ways. Ernest Hemingway, this is his period to shine. The Sun Also Rises, A Farewell to Arms. He, in many ways, represents that lost generation that came out of World War I, totally disillusioned with Western civilization. And he spent a great deal of time in Paris. Later on, he would retire to, of all places, Key West. And you can still visit his house there. And when you go to his house, you will find tons and tons of six-toed cats. Okay? Yeah. Okay. These six-toed cats are actually supported in his will. There's still money. The proceeds from his books continue to help to feed and house them. And they're everywhere in Key West, especially around his house. Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, Eugene O'Neill, all of these amazing writers that emerged out of this period of incredible cultural proclivity and explosion in production. It wasn't just in the written arts or the visual arts, although those are huge, but also architecture. This is the age of Frank Lloyd Wright, probably the greatest of the greatest known American architects. He not only created skyscrapers, but his use of concrete and steel, of hard lines, and of merging nature with construction. If you look at some of his houses, there are giant boulders in the living room. There are trees that grow up through houses. In one, there's a waterfall that runs right through the house, and the house is called the Waterfall. Okay. On top of this, you have the American skyline that's being redrawn. The Empire State Building will open up in 1931, constructed all through the 1920s. So there's so much going on in popular culture, but I got to tell you, in politics, we get among our most forgettable presidents during this time. In many ways, the 1920s is a repeat of the Gilded Age, in which we have largely forgettable presidents, and we have an incredible amount of political corruption coming from industry, from business. So that's really where the vibrancy is coming in American culture, is from business and from individuals, certainly not from the government. Warren G. Harding was, believe it or not, a sex symbol in his day. He was considered hot, okay? Warren G. Harding is what Americans wanted. After 8 years of Woodrow Wilson, they were done with progressivism, and the tide had shifted now. And Warren G. Harding comes in, and he's a guy that Americans could sit down and have a beer with, a regular fella. And that's what Americans wanted, and that's exactly what they got in a landslide victory in 1920. But we're going to see that the Harding administration is among the most corrupt in all of American history. There are so many different scandals that I can't even name them all, or even a fraction of them. Some of these would include the Teapot Dome scandal. This was an area out in Wyoming where oil was freshly discovered. And so the Secretary of the Interior is a guy named Albert B. Fall. he was in charge of the oil rights, of leasing these out. So what he did was he took a massive $1 million bribe from an oil company and he signed them out a contract in which they paid the American people $1 a year for all of the oil they were extracting out of the ground. By the way, that oil, when it's in the ground in America, belongs to us, not to a corporation, not to the government. That belongs to us, to you and me. So while the American people were getting ripped off, members of Harding's government will become incredibly rich during this time period. Oil scandals, the Teapot Dome scandal is probably the most famous of these. It's also under Warren G. Harding that the United States largely begins to withdraw from the world. Remember, we had rejected membership into the League of Nations, but it's really during the 1920s that the United States, as I mentioned before, cut down massively on immigration into the United States. And it wasn't just from Europe, a Europe that is still suffering from the long-term effects of World War I. In many ways, that's never going to end because World War II comes so closely on its heels, and Europeans want to get out of there. But Americans, because we set the Emergency Quota Act and others, are vastly limiting the number of immigrants that can come into the United States in the 1920s. This was supported by most Americans. This is what most Americans wanted at the time, and Warren G. Harding gave it to them. Problem is, Harding didn't actually spend a whole lot of time being president. He spent a whole lot of time with his series of girlfriends. And you can read online, he was a prolific letter writer, and some of the stuff that he writes is kind of borderline pornographic, like even for today. And some of the just, it's ooky, okay? It's like, reading your grandma's love letters. It's just kind of gross. Now, luckily for him, he died. He died in office. My son's loving that. Like, okay, but before all these political scandals could kind of come home to roost in Warren G. Harding's lap, he died. He had a massive heart attack while having sex with one of his mistresses. Awkward, right? Okay, he won't be the first one. He will not be the last American president to die under those same circumstances. And that is when we get Calvin Coolidge. And I got to tell you this story, okay? All right. So Warren G. Harding dies. And Calvin Coolidge was actually on vacation at the time. He was back in like Virginia or Kentucky, something like that, up in Appalachia. And he was going trout fishing in a stream, all right, nearby his ancestral home where his dad still lived. So Calvin Coolidge didn't like the fishing in this one stream, so he just went to another one, like 2 valleys over. So the president of the United States dies. The vice president is not even, they can't find the guy. For 6 days, Americans were looking for Calvin Coolidge and couldn't find him. So for 6 days, we had no president of the United States, all right? But again, at this point, presidents are so weak and ineffectual, it really doesn't matter. So they finally find Calvin Coolidge. And they inform him that, congratulations, you're now president of the United States. He goes back to his home and he has his father, who was a minister, an ordained minister, has him swear on the family Bible. And then Calvin Coolidge goes back to fishing. He finished his vacation. He spent another week fishing before he even bothered to go back to Washington, D.C. So for 2 weeks, we had basically no president whatsoever. And you know what? It really wasn't that big of a deal. Because at this time, presidents were kind of unimportant. We didn't really need them. Instead, it's Congress and it's big business that's really running the show. Well, okay. One more story about Calvin Coolidge, okay? This guy's going to be a one-term president. And he's a nice enough guy, but he's known as Silent Cal. And this is the age of the flapper, okay, of women speaking in public, really for the first time in American history. And for some people, for traditionalists, it was women's place to shut up, okay? Stay in your home, be quiet, don't talk. And Cal was very much a traditionalist. But at one of these White House dinners, one of these flappers got invited and was seated right next to the president. And she is just gabbing away, and he's saying nothing, all right? And finally, she gets tired of this. She gets mad, and she says, "Mr. President, I will bet you $5, which was a lot at the time. I will bet you $5 that I can get you to say more than 3 words." And Cal quietly just dabs his corner of his mouth with a napkin, sets it down, snatches the money out of her hand, and says, "You lose," and walked away. You kind of gotta love that. That is literally the most exciting story I have about Calvin Coolidge. Okay, this guy was a kind of do nothing president. He was very, very pro business. So here we have low tariffs, low regulations. So in many ways, Harding and Coolidge are just repeats of the Gilded Age, of that period after Reconstruction until the Progressive era. So a lot of the Progressive era legislation was either just ignored or overturned or done away with. And so a lot of the kind of the progress that had been made, at least for American citizens, and for limiting the powers of both government and of big business, were done away with by these more traditionalist presidents. And you can see there's Cal Coolidge. He comes in at the end of one term and then he runs for election, really, in 1924. And check out the division. We've talked about this North-South divide in American history and American politics, and you can see it so clearly here. Southerners, a Democrat named Ben Davis. I know like literally nothing about this guy. But the interesting candidate for me is the progressive candidate. There's still a progressive party. And this is a guy named Robert La Follette, or La Follette, as he usually pronounced it. And he comes from Wisconsin, which is a surprisingly progressive state. If you look at the history of Wisconsin politics, they have been a very progressive state, at least until the modern age, until the last about 15, 20 years or so. And La Follette was trying to keep this progressive movement going. But as a third candidate, he received 5 million votes, which is still a lot, but he only managed to win one state. And we know it's not the number of votes that you get, it's whether you win the Electoral College or not. So once again, we've got a very traditional South, and we've got a more progressive or modernist North and West. And we still see these divisions in American politics to this day, 100 years after this. If you look at modern electoral maps, you will still see that the Republican Party dominates the South, and it's coming to dominate more and more of the Midwest as well, whereas the coasts are dominated mostly by the Democratic Party. So it's changed a little bit over time, but we still see many of the same patterns going on. By 1924, the American economy is humming, okay? Europe is still having to recover from World War I. They're still buying a lot of our goods, and the money was just flowing into us. But the problem is what's happening in Europe is eventually going to come home. By 1924, the German economy had collapsed. What you're looking at, those are Deutschmarks, which are basically dollar bills, okay? And they were so worthless by this time that people were literally just sweeping them into the sewer, using them to heat their homes. Kids were playing with blocks of 1,000,000 Deutschmarks, like they're just playing with blocks, with bricks or something like that. In 1924, a loaf of bread cost 480 million German marks. 4.2 trillion German marks equaled $1 American dollar. Hear that again. 4.2 trillion German marks equals a dollar. So by 1923, the German economy had completely collapsed. The Great Depression begins here. Now, it doesn't come back to the United States for another 6 years, but the roots are there. We are actually invested heavily in Germany's debt with what is called the Dawes Plan, D-A-W-E-S. Now, this is the same guy that we looked at before. He's responsible for the Dawes Act, which separated Native American children from their parents and forced them to go to white boarding schools where their culture was purposefully destroyed. Their culture, their language, everything was purposefully destroyed. Dawes would also be important for trying to restructure Germany's debt so that their economy didn't entirely collapse. Problem is, this just delayed it, and it got the United States more deeply invested in Germany's debt. They will not be able to pay this off, and this is going to be one of many, many factors that are going to drag us into the Great Depression to come in 1929. Now, in the 1920s, Americans didn't see this coming, but looking backwards, we do. We know that in the 20s, this is an age of great advertising on radio, especially. And this is also when Americans start to buy on credit. Payment plans, buying on credit, spending money you don't have. That didn't exist before the 1920s. That wasn't an option. If you didn't have the cash, you couldn't buy it before then. But we start to see the extension of credit and payment programs. And eventually, we're going to see a lot of Americans that are going to extend themselves far beyond their capabilities to pay. Farmers invested heavily during this time in buying new land. In the 1920s, that's when John Deere starts to produce their famous tractors, and every farmer felt they had to have their own. Instead of, coming together in a collective, pooling your resources, a group of farmers buys one tractor and then shares it. Nope. Every single one had to have one. All you have to do, to see the results of this is drive up to Rockingham County, just a half hour north of Greensboro, and you will see dozens of these tractors sitting on the side of the road. Now they're antiques that nobody wants, but everybody in the 1920s felt that they had to have. And the money was rolling in. Farmers had never had it so good. Here's the thing, you got to know that the good times don't last. This is also the age in which Florida became popular as a place not just to visit, but a place to live. The 1920s is when probably one of the most important inventions in all of Floridian history came about, and that was the air conditioner, created by an African American. This is what made it possible, or even barely tolerable, to live in places like the American Southwest and in Florida. And that's where we see a lot of Americans moving in the 1920s. Well, that also means that people began to over-speculate on land. And the prices for land began to explode and rise very, very quickly. And today we call this a real estate bubble. Back in 2007, we saw the exact same thing, and that would be the main cause, although not the only one, of the last Great Recession, which in some ways we are still recovering from. Kind of. Well, here in Florida, you start to see more and more people investing in land in Florida, including American congressmen. Many of them began to invest in Florida. That seemed to be the place, and a lot of people were flooding in there. And then in 1926, Florida got hit with not one, not two, not three, but 4 hurricanes in a single year. Now, I grew up in Florida. Some of these are nothing. Some of them are incredibly devastating. I grew up when a massive hurricane hit Miami and leveled entire parts of the city. Homestead just simply ceased to exist. This happened 4 times in 1926 in Florida, and the entire real estate market in Florida collapsed. And a whole lot of people lost a whole lot of money. So this prosperity of the 1920s, or the roaring 20s, was built on very shaky foundations, on speculation on land, speculation on the stock market, speculation on whether Europeans could pay their debts. And a lot of Americans were buying things on credit, including farmers and businessmen and businesses, and just regular average Americans. As the stock market kept going up and up and up, a lot of Americans saw it as a way to make easy money. So they would borrow money, buy stock, and then if the stock continued to go up, you could sell that stock, pay off the money you owed and the interest, and you'd still have some profit left over. That is assuming that the stock market is going to keep going up. The problem is, as you all probably know, in 1929, it stops going up and it starts going the other way. And so once that starts to collapse, not only do you still own that now worthless stock, but you also still owe the bank for the money you borrowed and the interest on that money. And people just they just didn't have it. One of the greatest lessons I hope you can learn here is that unless you can pay cash, don't buy it. Okay? Seriously, you don't need credit cards to grow your credit. Pay your bills. That's it. Okay? Get an apartment with five other people. Who cares? And put the electricity in your name or the water bill, whatever, and make sure that gets paid regularly every month. And that's how you build your credit. You don't need a credit card to do that. And usually those only lead to over speculation on your own future. What happens when you bought a whole lot of stuff on that credit card and then the economy collapses and you lose your job? Those debts don't disappear. Now, we were an incredibly prosperous nation. At this time, if we had invested in long term gains in the United States, building our infrastructure, building highways, that would have been a huge way that we could have sped up transportation, encouraged more and more industry. We'll see that in the 1950s. But instead, Americans and businesses were much more interested in personal profit than in profiting the nation. And I would argue that that's very much like the Gilded Age and very much like today. Sadly, we all know that the good times are going to collapse. And in 1929, along comes the Great Depression. And this is going to open up the door to the rise of dictators like Mussolini in Italy and Adolf Hitler in Germany. And so the good times, these interwar years, are not going to last. And sadly, next week, we're going to look at one of the worst man made disasters of American and world history, and that is the Great Depression. It didn't have to happen, we let it happen. And hopefully, we can learn some lessons so that we don't have to go through it again. Maybe. All right, guys, that's it for today. Make sure you're keeping up with the reading. That's one thing I really noticed on the last exam. It's clear that quite a few aren't actually reading the text. And while you can define these terms from any internet search, that's not the same as learning. And you're not gaining that historical context and that big picture. Watch the videos, read the textbook, and I guarantee you will get much, much better results on your next exam. Make sure you get your historical context homework in by Friday and enjoy yourself. We'll see you next week. Okay.